Okay, let's get started on our first composition, which is called 3D Glasses Comp. Now, you've probably all seen at some point in your lives a 3D image. Now, whether it was a cartoon on a cereal box or something as modern and amazing as the Terminator 2 3D ride at Universal Studios, the effects and techniques are very much the same. The 3D illusion is created by offsetting two images to slightly different positions to be seen by one eye each and then pull back together into 3D perspective using a special pair of glasses. And these are things that you're probably very familiar with. Now, this relatively complex effect can be achieved with a few simple steps using the new 3D glasses filter inside After Effects 6, and that's what we're going to do in just a short while. Now, 3D glasses create a single 3D image by combining a left and a right 3D view. And you can see that if you go ahead and open one of these images in the 3D glasses source files folder here in the project window, just drop that down and we can see here there is either 3D shot 1, 2, or 3. Feel free to open either one. I'm going to open number 2 here. Just double click to open that. And you can see it's an image that has its color channels offset. Now, if I just zoom up on that a touch, we can see that you have basically a green and a red offset. It's a little bit more noticeable as you scroll around the image. You can see the edge of the TV screen here and various other parts. Now, basically, the further away the image is from the eye, the more it's distorted. You can see up on the top right-hand side here, it's very much offset. You can't really see any white detail. It's just red and green offsets. That is what pushes the detail further away from the eye. And anything you want to remain in focus or more towards the front actually stays pretty much connected in terms of red and green channels. Now, obviously, I'm mentioning red and green here, but don't forget we are discussing red and blue channel information. It's just the finished visual that you see is red and green, so don't get confused there. Plus, your glasses sometimes will be red and green lenses, and most popularly, they will be red and blue, so just another thing to bear in mind. Now, we can use any of these images that have been created in 3D programs or even using stereoscopic cameras as sources for the view in each eye and then use different methods to combine them for viewing. Now, we're going to quickly focus on something called an anaglyphic image, which can either be two identical face-on images, very similar to the one we have here, or two real-life or 3D images with slightly different perspectives of the same area that are tinted contrasting colors and then just superimpose on top of each other. Finally, all that information is pulled back together with your 3D glasses and you get the full effect of a 3D image. So before we start this lesson, if you do have a pair of red and blue or red and green lens 3D glasses, I suggest you go and dig them out from the bottom of that cereal packet and then we can see the fun as we progress. So where do we start? Well, we need imagery, a plan, and the 3D glasses filter. So make sure we have the 3D glasses comp visible so we can go ahead and close down the 3D image we just had opened. So now we're back to the main composition. And you can see that we have a 3D rendered car here and a Photoshop generated background. And if you just go ahead and do a RAM preview of that, you can see that the car is set to loop over that background. And what we're going to do is turn this image into 3 dimensions so the car stands out and the background actually pushes further behind. Now, before I get on to using the 3D filter, there's one filter I do want to introduce you to here, which is brand new inside of After Effects 6. And that's called the radial shadow filter. Now, this is one of the nice filters that creates very realistic 3D shadows from an object that's casting it. I want you to select the yellow render, it's called. This is the car graphic we have here. And then come across to your effects palette and let's just key in radial. And you'll see that radial shadow will appear down here. It's under the perspective header inside the effect menu. Just go ahead and double click that to apply it to the layer and the effect controls window will come up and we can see the new controls here. Now, you can see initially that a shadow has been cast around the background. If we just move this window up a touch, we can see that. You can see already that it's very different from the standard drop shadow you would normally use in After Effects, where the distance is continual all the way around. We can see here that the distance is a lot closer to the back end of the car here than it is at the front, and that's because the light source is over this area. If I just pull this out of the way, we can see this selection here. This is the actual point of the light. If I pick that up and move it, you can see the shadow move around accordingly. If I come closer to it, it's cast evenly across the center. I can go either side and push that in either direction. So this is a really nice little filter for generating very realistic shadows because it kind of scales the shadow as it gets further away from the image. And that's really how shadows should be. If I just pull the effect controls back again, just hitting F3 to do that, we can see obviously we have basic settings here such as shadow color, the opacity of the shadow, obviously the position of the light source, which we just moved, and then we also have the projection distance. Now that's how far the shadow is cast from the original. It's nothing to do with what we just did by moving the light source around, but if I drag that value, we can see the further I drag it, the larger the shadow gets. And this is just a really cool little filter. Now, one thing to point out here, if I drag this off a lot further so it's more off the edge of my layer, If I pick this layer up and just move it out of the way, we can see what happens is the shadow does extend beyond the boundaries of my layer, but we can't see it. It's being trimmed off according to the dimensions of the pixels on the layer. Well, that's not a problem. If we pull the Effect Controls window back, just come down towards the bottom, we have a little button that says Resize Layer, and if we turn that on, it will render out the whole shadow regardless of the size of the layer and give us much more room to play with. So that's pretty good fun. Another little thing up here as well is the type of rendering that the layer has. At the moment it's set to regular, so it's just a straightforward shadow. If you go ahead and choose Glass Edge, this will allow you to use any transparency that's inside the layer and cast color through it. So at the moment there are slightly transparent pixels on the edge of the layer that are yellow here and more gray around the edge of the wheel. And you can see that that's picked up here by the edge of the shadow. We have this very thin yellow line and it's gray around there. If I had the layer set so that the windows were completely transparent but maybe tinted red, we would see that shadow cast through here with a red tint to it. It's kind of like treating it as stained glass. So all we would need to do is maybe just up the softness of that. You can see the glass edge becomes more visible, and we're even picking up a little bit of a white highlight around the edge here. But because there's no transparency inside my shadow, we won't see any more color in there. But that's just another feature that you might want to bear in mind next time you go around searching for that effect. Now what we can do is just readjust some of the settings here. So I'm going to take the glass edge back to a regular shadow, and I'm going to take the projection distance and pull that all the way back so our car is pretty much back to where it was before we applied all the big changes. And let's also take the layer and shift it back down towards the very center. Now if we do a quick preview of that, we can obviously see the shadow nicely cast on the background, and you'll see it gets closer to the car and goes further away as the light source kind of moves around the car. This gives a really realistic shadow. But what we're going to do now is apply a 3D glasses filter to this background layer to push it further away from the car itself. So go ahead and close down the Effect Controls window just hidden behind there. And then what we'll do is let's come down to the timeline and just solo this layer here, layer number 2, which is the metal sign backdrop. Just turn on solo, and then all we'll see is that and not the car above it. And then what we'll do is just select that layer, and let's come up to the effects palette and type in 3DG, and that should come straight up with 3D glasses, and go ahead and double click to apply that to our image. Now again, we get our Effect Controls window come up, and we can see initially that we don't really have anything that we can relate to here. It just doesn't look right, okay? Well, the reason that this is set up like this to start with, we are viewing something here called a stereo pair. We can see that here in my 3D view. And that's basically for a rendering process for certain devices that generate separate images to each eye one frame at a time. In this instance, we would choose an image for the left and the right eyes, okay, and they could either be offset or standard, which have ideally been prepared to be offset from each other's perspective slightly. But for what we want to do, though, we're going to choose the same flat image and make a 3D element from it. But obviously, if that's the type of 3D process you're into, this is where you would find it. We would set a stereo pair. Now, what we'll do to start with is the left and right view. We're going to choose the metal sign backdrop that we're currently using. So go ahead and choose the first option there, layer 2. And again, in the right view, use the same. And we can see that we effectively have two duplicates here because we are viewing a stereo pair. Now, the next option down for the type of 3D information we're going to display, we also have interlace upper L, lower R. And again, if we choose that, it looks very much like the original one that we have. But if we choose to adjust the convergence value, we can just drag that slightly to the right. We can see interlaced areas appearing in the areas that will become further away from our view. Now again, this is an option that's for producing material intended for viewing with equipment such as polarized or LCD shutter glasses. These are the type that are used in the Terminator 2 3D ride, and these produce a wonderful effect. Very cool. And again, if that's the end result you're aiming for, this is where you would find it. If you are using this option, there are many interlacing options you must bear in mind. Ensure that the images have exactly the same vertical height in pixels. If there is a difference, even just in 1 pixel height, it would be the same as shifting the image up 1 pixel, and the fields can actually be flipped. So you'd end up with an image in one eye and nothing in the other eye. It would look very strange. Also make sure that the layer's position values are set to whole numbers and not just, a quarter of a pixel over to one side. Again, anything that could move the fields out of place, you need to make sure to avoid that. And obviously check that the footage you're using has also been de-interlaced using interpret footage. You obviously want to get the smoothest footage in there so you can interlace it again on output. Now each of the remaining options create anaglyphic images, the type that we want to achieve, and there are a few different settings in here to tint either eye to specific colors. We can see here that we have red-green LR and red-blue LR. Each one of these tints correctly, and it's actually offsetting the values using the convergence that we already specified, but you can see it actually tints the 3D imagery as well. Some people prefer this process and some people don't. Again, it's depending on what type of work you're aiming for. The one that we're going to use is right down the bottom. This is my favorite one, balanced colored red and blue. And this actually offsets the images apart from each other in 3D, but still retains the original tints and colors of the image. Now, the most important setting here that we're going to play with is, again, the convergence value. This determines how far these images are offset from each other, and that obviously means how far back this image appears from the items at the front. So we can adjust that to whatever we need it to be, but do bear in mind it's all dependent on the overall distance and what you see which is correct. So at the moment, a convergence of 12 is actually quite a lot. Now, if you are looking through your 3D glasses at this point, don't forget that the red lens should be on your left eye and the blue on the right-hand side. The convergence will actually be the wrong way around. The colors are going the wrong way. So we want to actually work with a negative convergence value. So I'm going to drag that back the opposite way. Let's go for a minus, and I'm going to go to about -6. Somewhere around there, it's not too much. But if you look at that through your glasses now, you'll see that the backdrop is now pushed further back, and it looks great. You can see it offset from around the outside. Well, how does it look with the car in place? Let's go back and turn the car on by turning off the solo for this layer, and then come back up and close down the effect controls window and do a quick preview of that. Now, one thing you'll notice when it's finished rendering and it's moving around, you can see the true 3D depth of this. The car now looks like it's floating way above the background. The background is offset using the 3D filter, but one thing that looks strange, and you'll notice it, the drop shadow that's around the car looks like it's actually on maybe a piece of clear film, which is at the same view level as the car itself. So it doesn't look like the shadow is on the background. It looks like it's kind of floating in midair. So what we're going to do is play around with a few settings so we can get that shadow actually as part of the background. So the shadow itself is still offset using the same 3D glasses values, and that's obviously what's going to make it work. The other cool thing about the 3D glasses filter is it can also be used on pre-comps, which obviously opens up even more fun because the pre-comp can also contain motion, so the background can move behind the elements that are in the foreground. That's exactly what we're going to do. Let's come down to the timeline and let's select the top layer, the yellow render, the car that has the drop shadow on it. And what we're going to do is just hit Command D or Control D and duplicate that. The reason we're doing this is we're going to have one car on top that doesn't have a shadow, and then we're going to take the second one and combine it with our background layers and just keep the shadow for that one, so that those will all be contained in one group. Now what we'll do is let's turn off the visibility for layer number 3, which is the metal sign backdrop that we've already been using. But then let's turn on all of these bottom ones. We have the shadow edge, the warning tape, the studs, and the metal backdrop. It looks very similar to the one we just had. But if I just hit the space bar and play, you can see that the background stripes are moving through the scene. So it's just going to add a bit of motion to it so we can see what's going on. Okay, just stop that and come back to the start. Now what we'll do is the top car that we have selected here, I'm just going to go ahead and turn off its effects. So there's no drop shadow on that. So the shadow we're seeing now is the one that's on the second layer. And let's take the second layer. I'm holding down the Apple key here, or the Control key on the PC, and I'm going to select layers 2, 4, 5, 6, and 7. These are the items that I wish to group all together and apply my 3D filter to. So let's just hit Shift-Command-C or Shift-Control-C on the PC to do a pre-comp. My pre-compose window will come up, and I will say, yes, I wish to move all attributes into the new composition, so I know that my shadow will appear in there as well. And then I'll make sure that the Open New Composition button is selected because I want to open this and go in and set one final thing. So go ahead and click OK, and the new composition will open. We can see all my layers are in here. So there's the original car with the drop shadow and all the previous layers that have the animation in. Just go ahead and select layer 1 in this composition and bring up the effect controls by hitting F3 for that. And I'll just pull that over here so we can see it. And the only one thing we're going to set in here is to say shadow only. So all we see now is the drop shadow and not the car. This will now combine it with the background, which we can apply the 3D to. And don't forget the car that's still inside the main comp doesn't have a shadow on at all now. So this will work really well. So close the effects down. We can also close this pre-comp down and drop it back to the main one. We can see the pre-comp one is in here now as its own standard layer. What we can do is apply our 3D glasses filter to that again now. It's still selected here in my effects palette. So just double click to apply it to my layer. Once again, we're given the stereo pair as a default. So I'm just going to go through and choose our balanced colored red and blue. Again, the left view and the right view will be the same, but this time it's going to be the pre-comp that we've just created. Let's pull both of those into view. And once again, set the convergence value to around -6. Okay, we know that one actually works. Now you can see the offset as a standard preview. The shadow here has this blue edge to it, or the green edge. That shows that this has been offset in the background and it's not in the foreground anymore. If you go ahead and put your glasses back on and do one final round preview, we'll see that we have the car in front, but the drop shadow and the metal background are now pushed way, way back, and we have a beautiful finished 3D scene.